Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you for downloading the Faith Life podcast of Discovery Fellowship Church. I'm your host, Pastor Nathan, here with my co-host, Pastor Matt.
Hey, guys.
We have a special guest on our podcast today, our good friend, Rabbi Jack Zimmerman. Jack, how are you doing today?
Hi, guys. Good morning. It's great to be with you, Matt and Nathan. And you know what? I'm in really good spirits this morning because he who watches over Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. And I just wanted to share that as we begin our podcast today.
Love it.
Awesome. Well, as always, if you would take a minute as you're listening to this podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you downloaded this. And also, I got to say real quick, I'm getting over a cold. It was last week, but this week my voice is still really froggy. So I'm very sorry if you're listening to this. If it's harder to hear me, my voice is a little bit lower than normal, a little bit messed up. But hey, also, don't forget, if you want to be a part of this podcast, you can email podcast@dfchurch.com. That's podcast@dfchurch.com, just like a few people did, which we will get to later. Now, as I said, before we jump into our main news segment, just again, we're very excited. We've got our good friend Rabbi Jack here. Today's episode, as we talked about last week, is going to be all about Israel, the current conflict. Maybe we'll get into a little bit of the history of it, and ultimately what we can do as the church in situations like this. And so before we jump right into that big, very complicated topic, I'm sure we're only going to be able to scratch the surface of it today. But before we really get into that, let's go into our news segment now. With news in the world today, generally, we try to find things that are relevant, that are interesting, that maybe our faith can have some impact in. With the topic of Israel today being on our minds anyway, the news story that I had found, I think kind of ties into this, as well as some other things that we've talked about. And so, Jack, I'm not sure if you've heard about this. I briefly mentioned this to you, but with the current conflict in Israel, there was some pictures that had come out showing it was like burned infants. It was really horrific looking imagery that we're seeing out of Israel, like what is happening there. And so these images were coming out. And then there was a response where some people were saying these images aren't real. They're AI generated.
Right.
And we talk about AI a lot on this podcast. And so on our last, I think it was episode 50, we had talked with Brady Shearer, and we were talking about how as more and more AI generated things come out, we're going to run this, like there's got to be some way to third party verify if things are real or not. And so these images were coming out. Then people were coming in and saying these are AI generated. But then other people were coming back and saying no. Like each side was running it through these things that will purport to tell if something is AI generated. And each side was getting different answers.
Results. Interesting.
And so it was really, fascinating to see already the impact of some of this AI generative stuff in a real world situation, because this has real world implications, right? If you can't trust what you're seeing, how are we supposed to be able to respond? Because if it's somebody using AI to drive home their point, well, it's just so manipulative. So I don't know if either of you guys had heard about this going on at all, or what you think about that.
Sure. If I can chime in, and I have heard about it. And, whenever I hear a report like this, and I've heard this several times, because, guys, as you know, since the attack against southern Israel by Hamas on October 7th, there have been protests all over the country, and indeed even other parts of the world. And these protests are, by the way, coined as pro-Palestinian protests, when in actuality, look, let's call this what this is. This is not pro-Palestinian. This is pro-Hamas. This is pro-terrorist. This is pro-people who want death on one side. If you're going to have a protest on something, how about let's have a protest pro-humanity? And let's express our grief and sorrow over any innocent life, regardless on what side of the border it is. Now, regarding the alleged AI conspiracy with these babies' bodies, I mean, first of all, look, anyone who comes up with this has the responsibility and the burden of proof since they are hurling the accusation. Right. What proof do they have that this is AI? And you know what? Just for kicks in our podcast, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, it's AI. Let's say Hamas didn't kill one baby, and that's all blown out of proportion. Are we then supposed to think, well, see, they're not that bad then because they didn't kill any babies? Okay. Are the explosions in southern Israel AI? Right. Are the photographs of Kibbutz Be'eri and Kfar Aza AI? There's only so much that you can make up. And when I see and hear from IDF soldiers and commandos, whether it's, Corporal Conricus, who's really the spokesman, or Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself saying, look, this has happened, this is real. Here are the photos. The Jerusalem Post has confirmed it. With so many putting themselves on the line saying it's real, if somebody can dispute it and prove it, come on in. Right. And we don't have that. All the other side is saying is it didn't happen. We don't think it happened. And those, by the way, who are saying it are people like a Palestinian protester at Hunter College who said, we don't think it's real, it's fake, and Israel is always using propaganda just as they are here. Great. You know what? Prove it.
Right.
Israel proves everything. The other side's got a gripe, prove it. And when you ask them to prove it, all of a sudden they clam up.
It kind of makes me think of, and it's crazy that this is still a real thing, but you hear this, it's like the people who are like Holocaust deniers, who are like, it didn't happen or it was exaggerated. That's still a thing. We hear people say that thing, and it's like, that's such a wild thing. And it's like, how can you actually justify that? And I don't think the answer is, I don't think you really can.
Right. And I've seen some of the responses online to some of those first pictures put out, and then someone else photoshops a different picture, and instead of a burnt baby, it's something else. And see, it only took me 20 seconds to make this in Photoshop.
Right.
So I can take a real picture of you right now, Nathan, and make you look like somebody else. Yep. That doesn't mean I didn't take a real picture of you. And so it's kind of the way that they're trying to excuse these terrorist attacks is kind of ridiculous.
Right. And I think that's I saw somebody else on Twitter, or X, or whatever we have to call it now, who had said, they were talking about, because it's not only have there been infants who have been killed or burned, there were some who were even very horrific things. And somebody was saying, well, yes, a lot of kids died, but only some of them were beheaded. And it's like, that doesn't make it better. That doesn't help your argument. And so it's a wild world we lived in. And I think that's why we felt it was really important to have this conversation. And I think before we dive into this bigger conversation, I think it kind of does bring up, though, I wonder how we can get to a point where maybe things are easily verified as real. With the rise of some of these generative things, it's like what we talked about on that episode, it's almost like you need a third-party group that has some sort of method where you can get their stamp of approval to say this was real, this was not AI.
Right, it's almost like an autograph certification company where they tell you, yes, this is an actual autograph, not faked, but for these AI things.
But you know what? At the same time, and I hear exactly what you guys are saying, and you're spot on, you're 100% right. Reality is that verification still does not necessarily mean agreement.
Right.
Example, we know about the Al-Arabi hospital in Gaza City, in the north part of the Gaza, where there was an explosion yesterday.
Yep.
And before the explosion, before the sound of the explosion withered away to silence, you had members of the squad posting on Twitter or X, look what Israel did, look what Israel did. They blew up a hospital and they killed 500 people. Right. The facts hadn't even come out yet.
Right.
But the facts have come out now. And the facts have come out where the IDF intercepted a conversation between two Hamas operatives. And you can hear it, by the way, there's a website called arutzsheva.com, ARUTZ SHEVA.com. It's Israel National News. It's a great site. I mean, we go to J-Post, we go to the Times of Israel. A lot of people go to those and they don't know about Arutz Sheva. But at Arutz Sheva, and I'll play it for you, they've intercepted a conversation between two Hamas operatives who basically say, uh-oh, now our goose is cooked because it's definitely not Israel, because Israel's shrapnel from its bombs is different from our shrapnel from its bombs. And it looks like it's either us or Islamic Jihad. Okay, now what are we going to do?
Wow.
So let's just say, So let's just say, for the sake of saying, we knock on Ayanna Presley's door, or we knock on Corey Bush's door, or AOC, or Ilhan Omar, or Rashida Tlaib, and we say, listen, you were a little short-sighted, not AOC, at least she was measured yesterday, but listen, Rashida, you were a little short-sighted yesterday when you went on Twitter and you said, look what Israel did, they blew up a hospital, because here's evidence that they didn't.
Right.
What do you think Rashida Tlaib is going to do? Is she, oh my gosh, I feel terrible. How could I do this to Israel? Let me go on right now on Twitter and post an apology. Are you kidding me?
Right.
It's not going to do anything, because it's more important for people to save face.
Right. And
especially if you're in politics, than to admit that you're wrong.
And I feel like I've seen, you can see examples of this where there was something that was incorrectly shared, and you can see it's got 10 million views or something like that. And even when somebody goes back and says, you know what, that was wrong, that'll get like 2,000 views.
Right.
And so even when they do come out, most of the damage has already been done. Most people aren't looking at that apology or correction. They just saw the original incorrect misinformation.
Yeah.
Do you know the story of I think her name was Malik? Do you know the story of Malik? And this was during the 2014 Israel-Gaza war. Because guys, look, I mean, this thing keeps on happening.
Right.
I mean, Israel drops leaflets and says, "Okay, get out of here. Hamas will kill you." The people get out. Hamas says, "No, get back in. We need you to die," and then we'll blame it on Israel. But come on, this is how it works. But in 2014, and I believe the girl was identified as Malik, beautiful, beautiful little girl. And the Palestinians had a field day with it, and they put her face up and they said, do you see, look what those Israeli soldiers did. Here's an innocent, beautiful little girl. Her name is Malik. She was playing outside, and she's dead. She's dead and gone. And look what Israel did. And people went nuts, because not only is this an innocent child, but a beautiful little girl. They said she was killed in the Gaza Strip. And world condemnation against Israel. A couple of days later, a mother in Moscow, Russia, which is, by the way, nowhere near the Gaza Strip, folks, a mother in Moscow contacts the news sources and says, excuse me, that's a picture of my daughter. And by the way, on the day you guys said we were killed, just so you know, we were visiting the Moscow Zoo. We had a great time then. My daughter is very, very much alive now. We don't know where people are coming from on this. Wow. Do you think for a minute that the Palestinian news service, why don't we call them what it is, Hamas, went on and said, oh my gosh, we're so sorry. We messed up. Israel didn't kill her. No, because right or wrong doesn't matter. What matters is you find anything and everything to blame Israel.
Yeah.
Period. The end.
Yeah. So you keep mentioning Palestine and then saying, let's call it what it is, Hamas. Can you give me just a little bit of a quick, is there a difference between those two words and how would you explain it?
Sure. I'll give you a very Jewish answer. On the one hand, there's a difference. On the other hand, there's no difference. When, for example, when the reports first came out about the bombing of the hospital in Gaza, the report said, and I think this was the verbiage on CNN initially, Israel attacks hospital in Gaza City, Gaza Health Ministry reports. So I wasn't crazy about the way that they placed the story, because if you only get through the first four words and you're intense, you won't read that it's another source quoting it, and that maybe that source isn't right. And what people don't know is there's another term for the Gaza Health Ministry, Hamas. They are the government in there. But in terms of Palestinian and Hamas, my goodness, there are so many layers to this question. First of all, there really are. First of all, there was a time years and years ago when Israel was called Palestina. And that was a name given to Israel when Israel was under Roman rule in the first century. And Rome said, guys, we detest you Jews so much. You're really a pain in the neck. And so what we're going to do is we're going to rename your land Palestina, because in the language, Palestina means Philistines. So we're going to rename the land after your worst enemies.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
in the early 1900s, around World War I, post World War I, when Britain basically had a mandate and authority over that section of the Middle East, that area was called Palestine. So yes, Israel from, say, 1917 to 1947, 48 was referred to as Palestine. And those who were Arabs basically said, hey, we don't want to have anything to do with Palestine. Don't call us Palestinians. In fact, in 1977, there was a guy who was a committee member on the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was put together by a guy by the name of Yasser Arafat. I told you there'd be so many layers to this.
Yeah.
And, the guy was doing an interview with a Dutch newspaper called Tro. And Tro asked him the same question, Matt, that you just asked. Where's this Palestinian coming from? The guy's name was Zahir Hussein. And here's what he said. He said, listen, I'm going to be honest with you. We made it up. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. We made the whole thing up. This is a Palestinian saying this.
Interesting.
And they said, well, why did you make it up? He said, we made it up because we're making the world think that we're the original settlers on the land by doing that, and that will help us in our cause to annihilate the state of Israel. But you've got this in black and white. A guy says, look, we made it all up. Hello, we're liars.
Wow.
And yet the world basically accepts that title. Hamas was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that started in Egypt some years ago. And when Hamas came into the Gaza Strip, they had been there for a while, but came in earnest in 2005. All you know what broke loose.
Right. Well, all right. So we're sorry, excuse me. We've started hitting around this main topic a little bit anyway. Before we dive in too much deeper, just in case any of our listeners or viewers maybe are not familiar with you, Rabbi Jack, do you want to give us just a quick little who you are, kind of what's your story? We call you Rabbi Jack. What does that mean? Things like that. Just a quick little recap in case anybody's unfamiliar with you.
You bet. I am a Jewish man who I love to say was born in the other Holy Land. That would be Brooklyn, New York. Came to ask Jesus into my life in 1988 when my new bride, Sandy, at that time, showed me the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament and how everything pointed to Jesus. It's kind of like a quiz show. Here's the Old Testament. Name someone who was born of a virgin, born in Bethlehem, suffered and died for our sins, had to die before the destruction of the Second Temple, and he's coming back again. Come on, this is easier than a clue on Jeopardy. And so, I asked Jesus into my life, and today I wear a couple of different hats. I serve as the staff evangelist for Jewish Voice Ministries International. We are an organization that understands the importance of blessing Israel, of engaging the church in the Jewish foundations of its Christian faith, and bringing the gospel to the Jew and the nations. Because listen, Jews don't have another way. They need the gospel as well. And that's why Jesus said in John 14:6, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. That's what he did say. He didn't say, nobody comes to the Father, except you Jews, because you're chosen.
Right.
No. And the other hat that I wear is I serve as the Messianic rabbi and or pastor. I'm both of a what's called a Messianic Jewish congregation, Tree of Life congregation in Phoenix, Arizona. And Messianic rabbi just means a rabbi who knows beyond any shadow of a doubt who his Messiah is. And his wish and his hope and his desire is that the rest of the world learns that too.
That's amazing.
Love it.
Amen.
Well, so let's kind of dive in. So obviously, this whole conversation has really started with this most recent attack. So is this, I guess, to start with, we know that there's always been conflict, turmoil, ever since Israel became a state again in 47, that there's just been conflict. What makes this one different, or is this just kind of what's more of the same?
You know, it's Nathan. It's both. It's more of the same, because this is not the first time, for example, that Hamas has used its own citizens as human shields,
right?
And when they try to flee, and when those human citizens dies, Hamas does what Alan Dershowitz calls is the CNN strategy. You parade the bodies out for CNN to put on TV worldwide, and the whole world freaks out and comes against Israel. What makes this different is that in the past, I mean, it's been primarily kidnappings of Israeli soldiers, and it's been bombs and rockets, and occasionally a Hamas operative will go through one of the many underground tunnels and, you know, shoot a couple of people in a car who happen to drive the wrong way into what's called the West Bank. This is very, very different. This was something, number one, that was orchestrated months ago by the Hamas terrorist group. This was different in that the walls and the checkpoints have never been breached so badly. And this is different because you've got just the brutality of it all. Yes, decapitating babies and going into people's homes on a kibbutz, which is such a cowardly thing to do, because first of all, Israelis can't carry guns. But if you want to find people who are the most docile, who are the most peaceful, who basically are the most the diametric opposite of warriors and militants, go to a kibbutz. You know, these people are so tender and so vulnerable. You know, if a Hamas operative comes in, the first thing that they'll do is invite them to sit down, and they'll serve him breakfast.
Oh, wow.
And, right. And so the brutality of it all just stuns me. Secondly, for all three components of attack by land, air, and sea to occur at exactly the same time. There are certainly some other similarities and differences, but those are the ones at least that come to mind.
Now, what exactly is, you've mentioned a couple times, like kibbutz. Wow. Could you go, what actually is that?
Sure, and I actually lived on one for a couple of months one summer some years ago in Israel. It was a wonderful experience. A kibbutz is basically a self-sufficient community where people, you know, go and spend as long as they'd like. You become a family. I actually went for a summer. And during the summer, what you do is this community, I mean, you know, they have a dining hall and they have houses or you know, little, I guess, cabins. And they say, okay, so here's the deal. Here's how it works. You come, and let's say, as an example of what I did, for 6 days a week, because you don't work on Shabbat, on a Saturday, for 6 days a week, you get up at about 6 or 7 in the morning, and we'll take you out into the fields where our corn grows or where our pears grow. And you pick corn and you pick pears from the fields, and you have breakfast, and around lunch, you're done for the day. And you do that 6 days a week. And the kibbutz, the community, takes what you've picked and sells it, obviously, so they can bring in an income. Right. In exchange, you get room and board, you get your meals, and the opportunity to experience the land of Israel. It's a great trade-off. That is an example of what a kibbutz is. So, you know, again, the communities that were attacked, these are simply people who, they're a big family, they're self-sufficient, all they want to do is live their lives, and that's part of the horror of it all. You know, Hamas was not going into, let's say, the Hillel Coffee Cafe, where they know IDF soldiers gather every Thursday at, let's say, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and gun them down. They knew who they were going after.
Wow. It sounds kind of like almost like what we would think of like a monastery, right? Where there's almost like, you know, this kind of communal living and things like that.
Yeah.
So that does definitely make it even more horrific. I've heard people kind of refer to this almost as like Israel's 9/11. Do you think that's kind of an apt comparison?
You know, it's worse than Israel's 9/11. This is the worst act of mass genocide of Jews since the Holocaust by the Nazis. And, you know, just to put things in perspective, because I believe at last count, there was something like 3,200, 3,300 Palestinians killed, 1,400 Israelis killed. Now, it's tough in our Western minds to recognize that, because we say, well, 1,400, okay, it's not so bad because, at 9/11, more than double that amount of Americans were killed. So maybe it's not a moral equivalence. It's even more than a moral equivalence, because let's understand something. Israel doesn't have the population that we do. So if you do population comparison, their 1,400 losses would be like the United States losing 50,000 people because of the great difference in population. 50,000. And if you think about it that way, then it really hits home.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
There's a lot of misconceptions, I feel like, as it relates to this conflict. One of them is it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think you already kind of clarified that it's Hamas and its terrorist attacks. But I've heard a lot lately of like, well, Israel shouldn't really even exist. Those are just like European Jews who tried to take over some land for themselves and, are now trying to be something that they shouldn't be. Like, can you help us understand, like, who is Israel?
You bet. And again, when I hear these claims from people, I find it amazing that all they have to try to prove their statement is to simply repeat their statement.
Right. Kind of a circular argument.
Come on, guys, give me a break here. It's like, you're so passionate out there making a claim. I would love it if somebody would prove it. Would love it. Right. Every apartheid, occupation, the border wall, this. Okay, great. I'm sitting. You got a captive audience. Please prove it. Please. Right. I've been waiting for somebody to prove it for like 50 years, for crying out loud. But what makes Israel Israel? There's a couple of things. In Genesis 15:18, God said to Abram, he said, Abram, I'm going to give this land to your descendants, 12 tribes, guys, all the way from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates in Iraq. So from the Nile in Egypt to the Euphrates River in Iraq, that's west-east, that's a lot of land. But point to point, let's do the borders around it. That's Numbers chapter 34. If you look at Numbers chapter 34, God gives you the rest of the borders. Put it all together. And Israel is a land specifically for the descendants of Abraham, but Israel loves everybody to come in who wants to live in peace. Yeah. Leviticus 19 says, look, Israel, treat the foreigner just as you would treat yourself, just as you would treat any loved one as your native born. And Israel does. But what you have here is a situation where in 1948, Nathan, as you alluded to, Israel became its one and only sovereign state. And this was a terrible affront to the Arab world. Were the Palestinians or the Arabs the original settlers? No. Again, Palestine for that land was not named for you Palestinians who made up the name 2,000 years later and said, hey, let's steal it. It was named after the Philistines. What happened is in 1948, when Israel became a state, you had some of the native people, the indigenous people who were there, Jews, and you also had Arabs there. The two groups are living together side by side. But the problem is that the Muslim world had actually had domination over Israel 2 times in the past 2,000 years. Twice, and they got kicked out both times. But during those times, they firmly believed that Allah had given them that land. They said that land belongs to us. That's why even in its revised 2017 charter, Hamas says, look, don't talk to us about peaceful solutions for a 2-state solution. There's not going to be a 2-state solution. Right. Why? Because we don't want a solution that contains peace. Why? Because we don't want a solution. We want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And not only that, did you hear the words of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah in Lebanon in the north? It said, kill the Jews wherever they are. So if this is about land and it's just that narrow strip of land and let's just annihilate the Jews and we'll take over that land. Yeah, apparently that's not good enough. That's a smokescreen, because if your own Muslims basically say, okay, yeah, now we got that land, but kill Jews anywhere. Hey, let's kill Jews in Australia as well. Yeah, but they're not in that land. Doesn't matter. We hate Jews. That's what this is all about.
Wow. I think this kind of highlights, again, some of these misconceptions that we hear, which is there's a lot of people who are saying, well, Israel is the occupying state and it's
Right.
all about this colonization type thing. And, they just need, if they were to just let these poor Palestinians, have their own land, everything would be fine. And again, I think this highlights, because I've heard that a lot. I'm sure you guys have heard that a lot from people, especially lately. It feels like everybody's like, well, I feel bad. Israel is the bully or the aggressor in this. And I think a lot of people miss, like, for instance, it was 2005, right, that Israel gave Gaza to the people, the Palestinian people, and said, elect your own government, govern yourselves, and they just put Hamas into power,
Right.
elected them as their official government, and that's kind of like Israel gave them. I think what we can see throughout, and Jack, you can probably speak to this, throughout their history, the people who have come to the table with the concessions has consistently always been Israel, who says, you know what, we'll let you have that. Just stop killing us.
Exactly. And look, guys, this has been going on for years. I mean, even when what was called the Balfour Declaration came to be, essentially what the Balfour Declaration is in this land in the Middle East, Jordan, Syria, what we now know as Israel. During the end of World War I, Great Britain basically said, the Ottoman Turks are in there right now, and we really want to kick them out and have authority over that land. And you're thinking, wait a minute, the crown, the queen, I mean, guys, you're like 3,000 miles away. What do you want with sand? 3-letter word answer, oil. But Britain couldn't kick out the Ottoman Turks on their own. So Britain said, hey, you Jews, you want some of this land. Arabs, you want some of this land. Tell you what, we can't do it alone. But if you guys help us kick out the Ottoman Turks, we're going to split up the land and each of you will have a piece. And they're like, yay. So Britain kicks out the Ottoman Turks, and now it's time to pay up. And Britain says, Israel, here's your narrow strip of land to the west of the Jordan River. And Britain says to the Arabs, here's your strip of land. It's a lot bigger than the strip. It's about 3 times the size they gave Israel, to the west of the Jordan River. And Great Britain said, Israel, Jews, are you happy? They're like, yeah, this is great. We're fine. Narrow strip, we'll take it. We'll start. Britain said to the Arabs, are you happy? They said, no. Why aren't you happy? You got 3 times the size of Israel. They said, you don't understand. We believe that we are also supposed to get Israel. Our God, Allah, tells us so in our Quran. And if you don't give us Israel too, we're just going to keep, rioting and blowing them up until one day we get it. And so for those who are saying, well, Israel should just give them land, newsflash. We have, as you mentioned, during 2005, in fact, in the year 2000, during what was called the Camp David Accords, then President Bill Clinton met with Yasser Arafat and Israel's then prime minister, I think it was Ehud Barak, and Israel agreed to give Yasser Arafat 97% of what he was asking for.
Wow.
There were some things, 97%.
That's
and
crazy.
Even Arafat's friends and buddies in the Arab world, when they heard this, they said, oh my gosh, we're calling to congratulate you. This is wonderful. This is incredible. Yasser Arafat, yeah, you're our hero. And Yasser Arafat looked back at Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and said, no. 97% isn't good enough. We want it all. And people were surprised. Why are you surprised? They've been telling you for years they want it all. What is, what is the big void over here? And when somebody says they want it all, there's no room for negotiation. It's not give us a little bit of land so we can live in peace. It's here's how this works. You die and we get everything you're living on.
Right.
Come on.
Wow.
Right. Well, so as we look at this current conflict then, and we kind of think about what's going on currently, this gets a little bit into our prognostication selves a little bit, but where do we think this goes? Like, do you think this current conflict, the response to what Hamas just did, do you foresee this going on for some time? Do you think, like, how do you see this playing out currently? With their, because you obviously you have to respond. You can't have somebody do this horrific thing proportionally larger than 9/11 to you and then just don't do anything, right? Like, this is maybe a chance for Israel to say, we need to just stop Hamas however we can. Like, how do you see this, Jack, playing out? And do you think this will be a long kind of drawn out war, for lack of a better word, or do you think this will be shorter? Like, what do you see this looking like?
Sure. I think that it's a great question, Nathan. I appreciate your asking it. I think that the chances, and I'm saying this right now. Well, let me just say this. I think the chances are greater for a protracted war, a longer conflict than a shorter one. But keep in mind, I'm saying this now, but who knows? Tomorrow at this time, hindsight being 2020, there's a possibility that I may say something else because at this moment, President Biden has flown to Israel, is meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do a couple of things. I mean, the president already said, listen, I want to let you know we're expressing our solidarity with Israel. We're behind you. We've already got the USS Gerald Ford and the USS Eisenhower, two of the biggest aircraft carriers in the fleet, right out there in the Mediterranean Sea. We are going to stand beside you. And the only reason I'm not saying, hey, I definitely think it's a protracted war is because I think that as this goes on, nations are going to get tired of hearing it. Israel will have the advantage over the enemy, and they will continue to say things like, you need to stop, you need to call for a ceasefire, you need to exercise restraint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what they're not getting is that should we, the United States, have exercised restraint when Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden came over and then threatened to keep blowing us up and killing Americans? Did you see anyone saying, we need to exercise restraint? Of course not. So why can't we give Israel the same courtesy of eliminating the same type of enemy that we were given the opportunity to eliminate all those years ago in 2001 and are still working on it, by the way? Right. So that's one reason I think that there will be a protracted war. I think there's another reason, and it also explains why why Israel has not yet gone into the Gaza Strip, because we're about supposedly a week late for that. The tanks have been there on the border. They said a strike is imminent, which is kind of like saying the day of the Lord is nigh. It's imminent, but we've been waiting 2,000 years or whatever it is. Why hasn't Israel gone in? I think one of the reasons that Israel hasn't gone in and why this will be protracted is Hamas came in on three fronts: land, air, and sea. Israel has to come in on three fronts, but they're different. Above, on the ground, and below. Let's not forget the tunnels, this labyrinth of tunnels all over the Gaza Strip that go into Israel. And so because of that, I mean, first of all, home team advantage, definitely, when you're doing hand-to-hand combat in a densely populated suburban area with buildings all over the place. Israel is taking its time, and I think it's the right way to go.
Do you see this spilling out beyond even Israel as other nations on either side getting involved? Do you see this becoming a larger conflict, do you think, or is it going to stay pretty local into Israel?
Well, it depends upon what country you're talking about. Right now, you've got saber rattling going on from Iran, which basically says to the IDF, okay, the minute you guys cross over from Israel into the Gaza Strip, there will be consequences from us. We're coming after you. And I know that that's one reason, obviously, why the U.S. has sent the Navy in. My concern, aside from Iran, would be to a little degree Jordan, to a little bit of a more degree Egypt. And let me explain why. Israel has peace treaties with both of those countries. But as Biden was flying over to Israel to meet with everybody, and this hospital was blown up, basically the leaders of Jordan and I think Egypt, but also Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian territory, the president, if you will, of the Palestinian Authority, said, our meeting with you is canceled. And I was really surprised that Jordan would do that, but they're doing that because they're believing the first reports that Israel blew up the hospital. And so my question is, and rhetorically, it's like I'd love to ask Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. If it's found out, if it's proven that it was, as President Biden used the term, your team did this and not Israel, then will you call back and say, okay, we were wrong, we want to reschedule? Watch what happens.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So I think as we kind of bring, again, a high-level discussion, there's so much more we could talk about. But as we start to kind of draw this for today to a close, what can we as Americans, as Christians, as the church, as people who care about what's happening, like what should our response be? What can we do? How can we help? Or what should we do?
There are a couple of things. Number one, and I'm begging with the church because some pastors are subscribing to something called liberation theology. And liberation theology basically says, look, Jesus came for the poor and oppressed. And it's the Palestinians who are the poor and oppressed. Israel's this big nation. And so we need to, we need to come against Israel. We need to say, shame on you. We need to censure her. And we need to support the Palestinians. Listen. Innocent Palestinians, the death of innocent Palestinians is horrible. I grieve over that. Yeah. When I see a 3 or a 4-year-old, they're in the streets that has been injured, I don't care if they're Israeli or Palestinian. That's a life. And we should grieve over an innocent life, regardless of what label is on it, regardless. Absolutely. But then to say, well, Jesus came for the poor and the oppressed. You don't think Israel was oppressed about 10 days ago when people who were trying to live their lives and babies who were just starting out had their heads cut off? Yeah. I mean, come on, that's number one. Number two, let's get the word out. I mean, Matt, you brought up before, there's so much misinformation about there. Israel is committing apartheid. Israel is this, Israel is that. These claims can be so easily disputed. Yeah. Why isn't our side disputing it? Why do we remain silent? When somebody says Israel is discriminating against Palestinians, how come nobody from our side says, hold on, time out. 20% of Israel's population is Palestinian. They have the same rights as Israeli citizens do. Yeah. A Harvard study and even a Palestinian study of those people showed that 80% of those Palestinians who are living in Israel say they'd rather live in Israel than anywhere else. If apartheid was truly in play and you were being discriminated against, why would you want to stay? Right. These straw man arguments are so ridiculous. And here's the other thing. The college students who are coming out and saying these things, they don't know what they don't know. So we, and Israel will even admit this, I've spoken to so many who live in Israel, I said, we are successful in many wars and battles. He said we are, but we keep losing the most important ones. I said, what do you mean? He said, we keep losing the battle of public relations. We don't know how to promote ourselves. And when people come against us, we don't know what to say. We don't open our mouths. And you know what? It's about time we did.
Wow.
I like that.
I have one more question, if you don't mind.
Please.
So in the midst of all this, like my mind, and I know the mind of a lot of other believers often go to, what does this have to do with the Bible, like where Israel is, right? Because we know Paul speaks in Romans 11 that all of Israel will be saved. Isaiah talks about the surviving remnant of Israel. What does all that look like in the midst of this conflict? And then how do I pray specifically for Israel and for God's will?
Great. Let's talk about the Bible first. As you were talking, two scriptures came to mind. One of them being Isaiah chapter 60, verse 18, and the other being Psalm 83, verses 5 through 9. The Isaiah 60, chapter 60, verse 18, essentially says, God says, there will come a time when violence is no longer in your land. And if you go to the original Hebrew, the word there for violence is Hamas. So God is saying 2,700 years ago in Isaiah 60:18, don't worry, Israel, because there will come a day when Hamas will no longer be in your land. Wow.
That's interesting.
Wow.
That's crazy.
So maybe, listen, guys, not for nothing, but if you're a believer in Jesus and you regard the Bible, all the more reason for you to say, for you not to tell Israel to exercise restraint, because the only way she's going to fulfill God's promise of Hamas no longer being in her land is if there's no longer a Hamas.
Right.
That's number one. Okay. Psalm 83, I believe we're seeing the underpinnings of that. And, you know, when this conflict broke out, it wasn't 2 minutes that I had people calling me and say, oh my gosh, is this the Ezekiel 38, 39 war? I'm like, no. First of all, guys, wrong direction. The Gaza Strip is slightly to the west. They're coming from the north. Look at your compass. What's wrong with you? But in Psalm 83 talks about a coalition of nations coming against Israel. Ammon, Hinnom, Gebal, Byblos, etc. Ancient names. But if you look up those ancient names and see where those lands are, guess who are the type of people it's talking about? Hezbollah, the Palestinians, Hamas, and a host of others. We're seeing that now. Last question. How should we pray? You know, the greatest prayer we can pray, aside for praying for the peace of Jerusalem, and we know that that will only happen when Jesus comes back, is I'm praying for the blinders to come off.
Yeah.
Because, look, this is all the work of the enemy who's been trying ever since he was threatened by God in the garden in Genesis 3:15 that one day Jesus is going to come, he's going to come to Israel, and he's going to destroy you. So is it any wonder why the world, guided mostly, unfortunately, unbelievers by Satan, is trying to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? Because the devil says, hey, Jesus, in order for him to get me, he's got to come back to Israel. I know, I'll convince the world to get rid of Israel. That way Jesus won't have an Israel to come back to, and I win.
Right.
So pray, obviously, for just the blinders to come off on people's eyes, that instead of seeking evil and being used as tools of this moron devil, that they would seek the God of peace.
I love that. Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
Well, let's move into our next segment. Now, again, this is my favorite segment. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's a little more serious. Today, it's not really humorous.
Okay.
So this is our Ask the AI Anything segment. So, Jack, what we do is I go into the AI, ChatGPT, I give it a kind of a crazy prompt, and then you guys get to just see what you think about what it thinks about this. Thinks is a weird word because it's a computer.
Right.
But what does the AI think about this? And so we actually had a suggested question that I went with today because I figured it was timely, and we'll see how accurate, Jack, you think this is. So what I asked the AI, I said, what were the 12? Normally we do 10, but for Israel, we're doing 12. What were the 12 most significant events in the nation of Israel's history? So what does AI think are the 12 most significant events in Israel's history?
Okay.
All right. Tell me, you guys can tell me if you agree or disagree. So number 12, it says the 6-Day War. In 1967, Israel's victory in the 6-Day War resulted in the capture of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and other territories, significantly shaping the modern geopolitical landscape of the region.
Okay.
That was a pretty big event, I think, right?
And that's number 10.
Yep.
And that's number 12.
Number 12.
Number
Sorry,
12.
number
Remember,
12, because
there's
we're doing 12
12.
of them.
All right. So number 11. Okay. This is kind of hilarious that this is as far down on the list. 11, the establishment of the state of Israel. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the state of Israel, marking a pivotal moment in modern Jewish history.
Yeah, I would have thought that would have been much higher.
You would think that would be a little bit higher.
Yeah, much higher.
Well, okay, let's keep going down the list then. Well, they say number 10, this is a more tragic answer, the Holocaust. The Holocaust during World War II resulted in the genocide of 6 million Jews and is one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history.
Right, I would think that's more significant also.
Yeah. Well, so it's going to be curious to see how this list goes as they continue counting down in terms of significance. So we're going over the entirety of Israel's history.
Yeah.
And so right now we're still kind of in the modern era, still continuing in the modern era. Number 9, Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. We talked a little bit about that today. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of the Zionist movement, culminating in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which expressed British support for a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so that's number 8, the Crusades. The Crusades' conquest of Jerusalem and subsequent struggles for control of the Holy Land in the Middle Ages significantly affected the Jewish population in the region. Yeah, we didn't even really get into that at all, but that is a pretty, I'd say, significant. Now, I'm not, excuse me, as familiar with that period of time. Who had control of Israel during the Middle Ages? Was it under Arab control? Was it Ottoman Empire at that point? Do either of you happen to know off the top of your head? Because I don't.
You bet. Both immediately before and immediately after the Crusades. It was the Muslim world.
Interesting. Yep. And so I think, was that part of the idea? I mean, when we talk about the Crusades, I think there's obviously a lot of terrible things that probably happened in that, but was the intent was to liberate, this Holy Land from the control of these Islamic empires, right? So even if things didn't necessarily go great, I think they maybe had at least a good intent. I don't know.
Right.
To a certain degree, the problem is that in the Crusades, many of these folks got so power hungry about killing everybody. In many cases, they killed the wrong people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
they kind of went after the Jewish people too. Also,
you bet.
All right, number 7. This is an interesting one. I don't know a lot about either. Muslim conquest and the golden age of Judaism. It says after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, a period of tolerance and cultural flourishings for Jews began in the Islamic world with important centers in Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. So the golden age of Judaism, I've never heard that phrase before, but in the 7th century, is that really what, how did that play out? Or is the AI just making stuff up?
No,
I don't know.
That was like a period where there was, I'm going to use the word peace, even though there's never really been complete peace, but there was at least better relations between the Jews and the Muslims.
Interesting.
Right? It's that.
Well, that was, if we're talking 7th century, that's like the beginning of Islam, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming they just they weren't as powerful
it's
yet,
rising,
and so
and it's still
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Number 6 on the most significant events in the history of Israel: the Bar Kokhba revolt, a failed Jewish revolt against Roman rule in 132 to 136, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, had a profound impact on the Jewish population in the region. So 132, this was after Jesus, after the temple was destroyed. I didn't even know there was much left of Israel by that point. I need to learn my history a little bit more.
There's a lot.
Okay, number 5, we're in the top 5 now. The Roman conquest and destruction of the Second Temple. In 70 AD, the Romans captured Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple. This event led to a significant dispersion of Jews throughout the world, known as the Jewish diaspora. Yeah, that is a pretty significant event in the history, because we had Israel as a nation, and then we didn't. Wow. Now, if we were to look back, I know that we're going to keep going on this list with some of these things. Like Old Testament, we had... Israel conquered, people taken out. We had the exile. We had people returned. And so, but there was never such a big gap, right? Because we had, the destruction of the temple, we had like nothing until the 40s, almost 2,000 years of time where there was no Israel. Whereas the other times, like Babylonian exile and things like that, they were destroyed, but they got sent back. And, you had a couple hundred years here and there. That's interesting. All right, number 4. Number 4, the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt resulted in the rededication of the Second Temple and the miracle of Hanukkah. It reaffirmed Jewish religious freedom. That's a good one. All right, number 3, we're in our top 3. The return to Zion. After the Babylonian exile, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland. Their return and the subsequent rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem are crucial events in Jewish history. So we're kind of just going back in time with each of these. Maybe that's how they ordered them.
Yeah, which then I have a guess for number 1 when we get there.
All right, number 2, Babylonian exile. In 586 BC, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and exiled many Jews to Babylon. This event marked a significant turning point in Jewish history and led to the writings of much of the Hebrew Bible. So that's number 2.
Okay.
What do you think number 1 is going to be?
Yeah, it might change now since number 2 is what it was, but I was originally thinking like when God chose Israel to be his chosen nation, right? Like the calling Abraham, the saying through your descendants. So that would have been my number 1 guess.
Your number 1 guess? All right.
It might be different.
Here you go. Number 1.
Okay.
It says ancient Israelite kingdoms. And it says this: the establishment of the ancient kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah around the 12th century BC is foundational to Israel's history. Well, I would say it's the founding of it. These kingdoms played a crucial role in shaping the identity and culture of the Jewish people.
Yeah, okay.
So it kind of did it chronologically. So starting with the founding of Israel as probably the most important part of Israel.
It's perfect.
I like it. So what do you guys think?
There were three that I was certain that I was certain would be on that list, and none of them are.
Okay, let's hear them.
The moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Okay.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
That was a big one. The Abraham Accords.
Right.
Israel normalizing relations with, Morocco, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates. That was huge.
Yep.
And perhaps that, guys, the biggest one of all, and I cannot believe that AI missed this. I mean, come on, it's obvious. The invention of the falafel. I mean, come on, give me a break. Come on. We wouldn't have any of this stuff were it not for the falafel.
The real number one right there.
They really missed the mark.
Oh my goodness, that was awesome.
The chickpeas, the sour pickles, the coleslaw. I mean,
Man, that's what I kind of want to eat.
Yeah,
now.
what's for lunch?
Seriously, that would be delicious. Falafel would be amazing for lunch.
So good.
Well, that's our AI segment for today. Remember, if you want to sponsor our AI segment so that we can get the better ChatGPT for, just email podcast@dfchurch.com. Sorry, dfchurch.com. And as we round out the show today, let's head to briefly go over some listener mail. Again, remember, you too can email us at podcast@dfchurch.com. Yeah, I am struggling.
dfchurch.com.
I've been talking too long.
Yeah.
dfchurch.com. You can email podcast@dfchurch.com.
Love it.
Now, we had some people write in this week, so we've got a couple quick questions. First of all, we had Abby write in, and she asked a question. Now, I think, Matt, this was related. You said, we know this person.
Yeah.
She had written in, and this is based off conversations you were having last night at Awana.
Yeah.
All right. So, she asked this question: wouldn't Jesus be his own birth father because he is a part of the Holy Trinity and God is also his father? So, Matt, what was the context of the question that she then wrote in to ask us?
Yeah, quick context, and then we can discuss it briefly. So, after Awana last night, we did some little Bible trivia, and it wasn't stuff I was just making up off the top of my head. I had a list of Bible trivia, and this one I think was meant to kind of trap kids a little bit.
Okay.
Or kind of a trick question. So the question was, who was Jesus' birth father? And I think what the question was meant to imply was, it's not Joseph.
Okay.
Right? Who is Jesus' real father type of thing? Not like adoptive father or however you want to put Joseph in. And so kind of a weird word to use, using the word birth. And the answer was God. That question. And so that's where Abby came in with her question of, well, wouldn't Jesus actually be his own? And so my initial thoughts with this is, well, you have two ways you can look at it, right? God the Father is one entity and God the Son is another entity. They're not the same. But Jesus himself said, I and the Father are one. And so I think that's where some of the confusion from Abby might be, is with that statement, right? But that's not saying that they're one entity. That's saying that there's perfect unity.
Right. So I think we have to, again, whenever we get into concept or discussion of the Trinity, it gets a little bit tough, because what we're trying to do is find something in our experience that we can relate and connect it to. Whereas God is such a unique being that there's no way we're going to find anything that's an actual perfect comparison. And so I think, remembering three distinct persons, but one distinct being is going to be the part of answering this question. And so you don't want to fall into what they would call modalism, which is there's one God who acts in three different ways. And that's kind of what it sounds like her question is getting into, right? Is Jesus his own father? Because if Jesus is God and God is his father, then Jesus is his own father. Right. But it's not as if God is somebody who acts like a father and acts like a son and acts like a spirit. It's three distinct and unique persons. And you can kind of start to get into some weird questionings, because then you have to say, well, what does it mean for Jesus, for God to be the Father and Jesus to be the Son? What does a father-son relationship even mean outside of biological procreation? So we definitely get into some
Yeah.
tricky
There's
territory.
a whole podcast topic here.
We could probably do a whole podcast topic there, but I think the biggest thing to remember, and Abby, if you're listening to this, is getting that idea of Jesus is not acting as the Father, that the Father is a distinct person in this being, singular being we call the Trinity. Hopefully that helps delineate it a little bit. Another email we got in this week. Oh, wait, did you have something you wanted to add to that, Jack? Sorry.
Yeah, and guys, you're right. There's no analogy that we can use that's going to address this exactly. We don't have any people say, well, what about water? It's a gas, it's a vapor, it's this. No, it doesn't do it. But let me see if I could at least maybe get somewhere close to scratching the surface. And when I come to Discovery Fellowship Church, I use this analogy every single year when at the Passover Seder, when we get to the part of the hard-boiled egg.
Yeah, exactly.
And I say, guys, look, I say you got one egg, but there are three, let's say, essences to it. You got the shell, you got the white, you got the yolk. The yolk is not the white, the shell is not the yolk. But they're each considered egg, but they're not the same. Each one is a different, let's say, emanation. You could call it like that. Again, not an exact analogy by any means, but if that helps, Abby, terrific.
Awesome. Love it. Now, another email we got from Jeremiah. Jeremiah, excuse me. I'm going to save a lot of your email because really you gave us some great feedback from our discussion last week about kids ministry. And we're doing a part 2 to that episode. And so when we hit that second part, we're going to come back to this email and kind of react a little bit with Mickey and Morgan, our kid ministry director and his wife, and kind of see what they think about those. So I didn't miss your email. We're going to come back to it. And so that's it for our email today. Again, if you would like to email us, podcast@dfchurch.com. Let us know what you think about everything we're talking about today, questions you might have, or topics you want us to cover. Next week, we are going to be talking about, this is going to be kind of a spooky episode because next week we're talking about should Christians celebrate Halloween, what that looks like, what does that mean? So you're not going to want to miss that. In fact, email us right now. Let us know what you think. Is it okay for a Christian to celebrate Halloween? Podcast@dfchurch.com. I want to thank again, Rabbi Jack. Thank you so much for joining us today, having this conversation with us. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, would you mind real quick just letting us know, Jack, how we can stay in touch with you, support your ministry and what you're doing?
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. With everything going on in Israel, we have 85 partner organizations with boots on the ground in Israel who are reaching the soldiers with food, who are attending to single and pregnant mothers who are already vulnerable, who are providing grief counseling for people who've lost loved ones, or they lost their homes, they've lost their cars, they've had nothing. And what we at Jewish Voice Ministries have decided to do is we're going to find a way, we're going to send support so that it reaches those people. And, if you're watching the podcast, if you want to be a part of that, guys, it's really easy. Just go to jewishvoice.org/Israel. It'll take you to our page. It'll let you know point by point exactly what we're going to be doing, where your money is going, and how it's going to be helping out in Israel. So we really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll make sure I get that link in the description as well. So there'll be a link directly in the description as well to make sure you guys can get to that. All right. Well, we will see you all next week. Thanks again, Rabbi Jack. Thank you again, Matt. And have a great week.
Bye, guys.